Jazz 88.3 in the new jazz thing. Music there from Paul Keeling and his 2011 release, The Farthest Reach. Paul Keeling joins us tonight in studio. Paul, thanks for hanging out with us tonight on the new jazz thing.
Oh, thanks. It's nice to be here. Nice to be back in San Diego. Thanks for having me.
So, yeah, you were here in San Diego. You grew up in Del Mar, right?
That's right.
And was Del Mar where you started playing music and got first exposed to jazz?
Well, I grew up in I was the youngest of 5 children, and our family was very musically involved, but predominantly classical music, mostly spearheaded by my father, who was quite an accomplished classical pianist and kind of a classical aficionado. So I wasn't really exposed to jazz music until quite a bit later, really as an early teen. Of course, I was listening to the kind of rock and pop of my day. And that was an influence, but it wasn't really until the turning point for me was hearing going out to hear the Pat Metheny group. We just heard I covered a tune there by Pat Metheny on the CD when I was about 13. I was by far the youngest person in the audience, and it really blew my mind. And to me, it was sort of a kind of a heavenly fusion of the beauty and complexity of classical music, which I was familiar with, and also the kind of intensity and excitement of rock and roll. So that got me started and interested in jazz. Of course, Metheny's kind of an anomaly, so I got more into straight-ahead jazz later.
Right. So was Lyle Mays the pianist?
Yes, that was who I saw playing the piano on the stage, and I was, listening to that and watching that, I sort of said to myself, I want to learn how to do that. I want to understand what those guys are doing.
So what was it about that? Can you take us back there? Like, what were you thinking that was so different from what you had been doing with music that really got you?
Well, I think it was the melodic conception, which to me had elements of Bach and Haydn and the things that I had grown up with, but also, as I said, the energy of the band. They had sort of this, almost kind of a rock and roll appearance. Long hair, and they kind of ran out on the stage, and it was very exciting, and it did sort of it was a kind of a magical combination for me of those elements.
And we were listening to, as you just said, music from your 2011 release, The Farthest Reach, and we're listening to a Pat Metheny tune on that one. Do you feel like that influence of Metheny is something that still pushes you and influences the music that you do? Absolutely,
it's huge, and in a lot of ways, I still really like the music. My taste in music is about the same as it was when I was 15 in many ways. I of course ended up diversifying. I mean, once I didn't really know what jazz was, and Metheny is, as I said, kind of a unique figure. But because I was interested in, he kind of turned me on to jazz. I then started investigating the kinds of players that were influencing him. So that got me into the Miles Davis and all the great masters, and that started me down the path of a more straight ahead jazz approach.
Oh, that's such a beautiful thing about jazz, is that whole idea of going back, and I think most music lovers do that, going back to the influences of the people that they like, and it's really rich, jazz is.
Exactly, and Metheny was kind of the hook for me, and I still listen to his music and go back to that music, but also he was kind of a bridge to a lot of other great music as well.
Well, you also played here in San Diego with one of the standard bearers in jazz, kind of jumping forward to the 90s. You played with Gilbert Castellanos. Tell us a little bit about how you met Gilbert and your time with him.
Well, he came down to San Diego. He was living in L.A., and he'd been doing a lot of work with this pretty impressive band called Black Note, which had recorded some albums on some record, I think on Columbia Records, and had toured around the world. And he was asking around in San Diego about and sitting in and finding out who was who. And I believe he just pretty much got my phone number from on the basis of a recommendation. So we had a couple of rehearsals and formed a band that basically stuck together almost in a very fraternal way for about 4 years.
Wow, that's a good amount of time to be together and play. What kind of things did you pick up from Gilbert, or did you see in Gilbert as you were playing with him at that time?
Well, until that time, in many ways, I consider myself kind of a half-assed jazz player, and Gilbert really, it was a hugely formative period for me, a period when I was really absorbing a lot, and Gilbert kind of directed me to the, I think, to a lot of the music that I really needed to take in to get the grounding that I now feel I have, and specifically the sort of 1960s Blue Note era of jazz, which was really his, I think, his main channel for music. And so I started really, and he had this incredible CD collection, so I was just going in there and copying like crazy and checking out all the Freddie Hubbard records, Lee Morgan, Kenny Dorham, the trumpet players, of course,
right.
But also, so Hank Mobley, Joe Henderson, all those classic records, and of course the piano players
right.
on those records, and basically copying their stuff.
Right.
So it was very, and I love that music, and I can definitely credit Gilbert for bringing that music more to my attention and understanding how important it is in the sort of pedigree of jazz music.
Yeah. Well, let's. I'd like to hear a little bit more music, but I want to make sure that folks know about your upcoming date here in San Diego. Can you tell folks about the show in Little Italy at 98 Bottles?
Yes, it starts at 8 p.m. And it's a trio gig, piano trio with Rob Thorson on bass and Duncan Moore on drums.
On the 14th of January, so that would be this...
on this Saturday, the 14th, that's right. It's on Kentner.
Right.
Kentner, 2400 Kentner. It's going to be a trio gig. The CD is actually a mixture of quintet material and trio material.
Right.
But I'm going to be playing some of the quintet stuff in a trio format.
And Rob Thorson, I was reading in Robert Bush's review of your disc and a preview of the show. Rob Thorson had something to say like, "Oh, Paul is a really great creative musician." Do you know Paul? Rob?
That's very nice of him. Rob is someone I've got to know and played with in that period in the 90s when I was still living here.
Excellent. Yeah, Rob and Duncan are some great musicians and are great friends of jazz and Jazz 88 here in San Diego.
Yes, and they're really in-demand musicians here in town.
Exactly. Well, I've got Alpenglow queued up, and we can listen to a little bit of that before we chat a little bit more. Anything you want to say about this?
Well, this is a tune that again, I think reflects, in many ways I'd say this is a tune that doesn't reflect the Gilbert influence very much, because I have sort of two streams of music that I think I pull from, and one of them is the kind of material that I was dealing with Gilbert. The other, though, is a sort of a more, I don't know, you might describe it as sort of something more like an ECM, ECM being a record label out of Europe, starting from the 70s. So this tune has got kind of the melody is kind of almost a Keith Jarrett kind of vibe to it.
Right.
And so it's kind of a more open, straight eighth feel as opposed to a more swinging feel.
And an original composition by you.
This is an original. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, let's check this out. This is Alpenglow. We're chatting with pianist Paul Keeling. This is from his 2011 release, The Farthest Reach, on the new jazz thing, Jazz 88.3. Jazz 88.3 in the new jazz thing. Music there from Paul Keeling and his disc entitled The Farthest Reach. We're listening to an original composition of Paul's called Alpenglow. Paul's joining us in the studios this evening. Thanks for hanging out with us tonight.
Oh, thanks.
So you grew up here in San Diego and you played music here. And then in the early 2000s, you left San Diego and eventually moved up to Vancouver. So why'd you leave San Diego?
Well, primarily because of a love interest. My
It's always
wife,
a good reason.
Yeah, we were married in 2000. She's from Canada, and she was going to be doing a PhD in Edinburgh.
Oh, Scotland.
Scotland. And so shortly after September 11th, coincidentally, 2001, we went there, and I spent 3 years in Edinburgh, kind of really just tagging along with her. But ended up finding out that there was somewhat of a jazz scene, believe it or not. Yeah. Scotland doesn't immediately come to mind when you think of jazz. But you know, like most big international cities in the world these days, you will find people who play jazz. I mean, jazz has been exported to the world, and people are playing it in their own way.
Right.
And so I ended up doing a bit of stuff there, and a fair bit of solo piano, actually. I mean, sometimes pianists, to get work, you got to do solo, you know, play the hotel gigs and things.
Casual.
But that was okay, yeah. I got hooked up with a singer over there, and ended up actually doing a master's in philosophy, which is another kind of interest of mine,
nice.
In addition to music. And then we returned back and moved to Canada at Vancouver about 2005.
How's the Vancouver jazz scene?
It's got a lot of really good musicians, and maybe this is really pretty common in a lot of the big cities, but a lot of good musicians, not a lot of places to play.
Right.
So it's not an easy go. But artistically, it's pretty happening. There's lots of good musicians on every instrument there. There's one main jazz room called the Jazz Cellar, which is kind of the dedicated 7 nights a week place, and the guy brings in pretty much international people on the weekends, and you can get a weekday there. So I played most of the main jazz rooms in Vancouver, and I've also been able to play in Montreal and Ottawa and other places. So, but the scene is it's different than San Diego. There's a couple things that are interesting about it. One is that it's got quite a strong free jazz scene. So it's a lot of it's pretty experimental, somewhat avant-garde, and also there's a lot of there's three interesting things about it. The second interesting thing is there's quite a lot of women, female jazz musicians. You know, jazz is often a pretty male-dominated scene, and there's a lot of really interesting female jazz musicians, as well as a lot of characters who play multiple instruments. I don't know what it is about Vancouver, but there seems to be this theme of guys who gig equally well on 3 different instruments. I mean, there's a guy in town here, Bob Weller, who's a great pianist and drummer. He's an example, but there's about 10 guys like him that play 3 instruments.
Wow.
So I don't know where that comes from.
Well, so I want to kind of end things with another tune from the disc, but I want to make sure that people know, again, the information about your gig here in town. Before we do that, Paul, what kind of things are you working on now? Do you have what are your plans for the future for your music?
Well, I've got enough material now, I think, to make another CD, which I will probably do maybe in a year or so. And I've got some new original compositions that I'm also going to be playing on Saturday, so unrecorded new stuff that I'm going to be trying out on the gig. And so I'm actually getting more into composing now, which is really a new thing for me, and I'm finding I'm really enjoying that a lot.
Excellent. Well, Kia, you've got some really good compositions on this one, and we're going to end things with a tune of yours called Mauna Loa. Anything to tell us a little bit about this before we get to it?
Well, this is a tune that's actually kind of old for me. I wrote it, I believe I wrote it during the period when I was playing with Gilbert, and I think we may have even played it a couple times in his band. This is a good example of a tune that I think that sort of reflects the influence of that period, that band, on my musical consciousness. And so it has a little bit of that kind of sort of hard-hitting, energetic kind of blue note feel to it, and that's what that tune's sort of about. Well,
Paul, it's been great to meet you, and best of luck going forward. Enjoy your time here, back with family and friends here in San Diego. And it's great to play your music here, and look forward to seeing more of it in the future.
Oh, thanks very much, and it's been really fun to see my old friends here in San Diego. Thanks for having me.
Paul Keeling here on the New Jazz Thing, and music from his disc, The Farthest Reach. We'll put links out on the New Jazz Thing Facebook and Twitter feeds to information about the upcoming date this weekend. This tune is called Mauna Loa. Coming up, we're going to be chatting with Ian Tordella here on the New Jazz Thing, Jazz 88.3. Excellent.